Montana Territory, 1878, the kind of cold that bit through wool and bone hung in the air when the bidding started. $5 for the tall one, barked a man in a long gray coat, his voice scraping sharp in the wind. Penelope Prescott stood still on the wooden platform outside the livery barn, chin high. The men below laughed like it was a joke. She was 6 feet tall in her bare feet, and not one of them could look her in the eye without mocking something. "Too tall for a wife," one muttered. "Too tall to keep quiet," another said. She had been sold by her uncle, her only living relative, after her parents died in a fire last spring. He claimed he could not feed her, not when there was no man willing to wed her. She was 22, unmarried, and now stood like livestock in front of strangers. The man who gave the winning bid was a rancher from 3 towns over. He looked her up and down like she was a sturdy mule and jerked his thumb toward the wagon. She climbed up, hands cold and empty. She did not cry. 2 days into the journey, she was already working the ranch the man's wife had passed, he said, and he needed someone to cook, clean, and tend his 2 boys. But it was clear quickly enough he did not want a wife. He wanted control. Penelope kept her head down, did the work, fed the children Jacob and Jesse, sweet boys both under 10 who missed their mother more than they knew how to say. But she slept with a knife under her straw pillow. She knew the look in the rancher's eyes. It was near dusk 1 week later when the cowboy came. He rode in quiet, a dark bay horse under him and a rifle slung across his back. He looked like trouble, but the kind of man who did not speak unless he meant something by it. "Name's Rhys Reddale," he said simply, stepping down from his saddle. "Looking for work." The rancher narrowed his eyes. "Not hiring." "I heard different," Rhys said, "and I am not the type who asks twice." Penelope watched from the side of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron. Rhys's voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. The rancher's eyes shifted, calculating. But he was greedy and desperate for help after a storm had torn down half his fencing. "Fine," he muttered. "You can sleep in the loft. Feed starts at sunup." Rhys only nodded. That night, Penelope found herself outside near the well, drawing water for the boys' wash. Rhys stood a few feet off, leaning by the fence post, watching the sky. "Why are you really here?" she asked, her voice low. He turned slowly. "I saw what he did, the auction." "I was passing through," Penelope stiffened. "Then you saw me sold." "Yeah," Rhys said, voice steady, "and I have not stopped thinking about it since." She held his gaze, unsure what to say. "You do not belong here," he said quietly, "and I am going to get you out." Penelope shook her head. "You do not know him." "I do not need to. I see the fear in your eyes." Her throat tightened. "The boys, he has 2 sons, they need someone." Rhys stepped closer. "They need someone safe, and so do you." The next day, Rhys worked the fencing. Penelope kept her distance. But at supper, he sat beside her, passing the bread first, letting her speak when the rancher tried to silence her. That night, she watched him from the loft window, sitting by the fire with the boys, teaching Jesse how to whittle a stick into a bird. The next morning, the rancher found the knife under her pillow. "What is this?" he growled, holding it up. Penelope stood tall. "Protection." He raised a hand. Rhys was there in an instant. "Put it down," he said, voice cutting through the room. The rancher turned, sneering. "This is my house." "Not anymore," Rhys said. "You laid hands on her, I will put you in the ground." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The rancher backed down. He saw it in Rhys's eyes there would be no second warning. That night, Rhys packed the boys' things quietly. Penelope stood by, heart pounding. "We are leaving," he said simply. Penelope looked at the boys. "You are taking them too. They are not safe here. They trust you. They trust me." She nodded, blinking fast. "Where will we go?" "I have a cabin near the Bitterroots. It is quiet." "Enough land to make something of it." Penelope looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He stepped closer, reaching out and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Because no one should be sold like you were. Because you are not too tall. You are just right." Her breath caught. "And because I have not stopped thinking about you since the moment I saw you stand proud on that platform, like you were not afraid of them." She looked up at him. "I was terrified, and still you stood." He smiled, soft and real. "Come with me." We will make something better. Penelope closed her eyes, then opened them. Yes. They left at first light, the four of them riding west. Rhys rode ahead, the boys in the middle, Penelope behind them, watching the sun rise over the hills. She did not look back. They reached the Bitterroot foothills after 6 days of steady travel, the kind that left a man's back aching and a woman's fingers cracked from cold rains. Snow still clung to the north faces of the ridges, but the valley below was beginning to soften under spring's slow breath. Rhys led them down a narrow trail flanked by lodgepole pine and tamarack. The cabin stood in a stand of cottonwoods near the river, small and weathered but solid. Jesse scrambled down from his saddle, boots slipping in the half-thawed mud. Jacob followed, quieter, eyes scanning the trees like he expected trouble to come hollering out from behind them. Penelope dismounted last, her skirts damp at the hem, hands stiff from the ride. Rhys caught the reins as her boot touched the ground. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice just then. Her legs trembled slightly, not from fear but from the strain of the road finally giving way under her. He opened the cabin door and let the boys run in first. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's warm." She stepped inside. The place smelled of dry pine and old tobacco. A stone hearth stood at the far wall, ashes swept clean. The table bore marks from a hatchet blade, and a handmade quilt hung over a cot tucked in the corner. It was a space built by someone who lived alone for a long time. Rhys unlatched the back window. "We'll cut more wood tomorrow. River's close good for the garden once we plant." Jesse had already found a pine cone and was showing it to Jacob like it was treasure. Penelope crossed to the hearth, knelt, and began building a fire without asking where the kindling was. Rhys watched her stack the wood, her movements practiced, efficient. "I'll sleep with the boys," she said without looking up. "We'll take the cot, all 3 of us." He didn't argue. Instead, he went to fetch water from the river and came back with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hands red from the cold. She met him at the door with a towel. "You didn't have to do that without gloves," she said. "I've done worse." She took the bucket, set it down, and turned back with a quiet intensity in her gaze. "You lived alone here, a while." "Why?" He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe. "There was a woman once. We planned to build a place farther west near the Clearwater. She died before we got there. After that, I came here." Penelope didn't speak for a moment. The fire crackled behind her, casting her face in amber light. "You loved her." "I was going to," he said. "Never got the chance." Penelope nodded, not out of politeness but understanding. She knew something about love that never had a chance to start. She went outside before supper, gathering fallen limbs for firewood. The light was fading, and the sky took on that deep, bruised indigo that meant the stars weren't far behind. Rhys joined her with an axe over his shoulder. "You don't need to, I want to," she said. They worked in silence, the kind that didn't strain or ache. When she bent to pick up a thick branch, he steadied one end without asking. Their breath came in small clouds, their hands moved in rhythm. "Did you always live in Montana Territory?" she asked, not looking up. "No, born in Missouri, rode north in my 20s. Too many ghosts back there." She nodded. "I was born in Kansas. Never thought I'd leave. Folks don't always get to choose their leaving." "No." A gust of wind stirred her hair loose from its knot. Rhys watched her tuck it behind her ear but said nothing. When they walked back to the cabin, Jesse was asleep on the floor wrapped in a blanket, and Jacob was poking at the fire with a stick Rhys had whittled on the road. Penelope knelt beside him. "Time for bed." "You gonna stay?" Jacob asked, voice small. She brushed his hair back gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She tucked them in, then stepped outside again. Rhys had poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed her one. They stood near the fence, the stars sharp above them, breath rising in the cold. "I wasn't sure you'd come with me," he said. "I wasn't sure either." "What changed your mind?" She took a sip, the heat grounding her. "You didn't ask for anything." "I still won't." She turned to face him. "You think you could ever love someone who's not easy to keep?" "I don't want easy," he said. "I want real." She held his gaze, the quiet between them thick as wool. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was something close. A beginning shaped by firelight and frost, and the slow, steady certainty of two people who'd survived what tried to break them. Inside, the boys slept soundly. Outside, Rhys and Penelope stood side by side, not touching, not yet. But the space between them was no longer empty. Snowmelt ran fast in the river behind the cabin, rushing over smooth stone in a voice louder than it had been days before. The thaw came gradual, but came all the same. Penelope felt it in the loosened earth beneath her boots, in the shift of scent in the wind, wet bark, turned soil, pine warmed by sun. She was hoeing the garden bed just past the shed, sleeves rolled and her braid tucked under a scarf, when Rhys returned from the ridge with the boys and a young pine sapling slung over one shoulder. Jacob ran ahead, arms flapping, carrying an empty pail. "We found a spot," he shouted. By the flat rock, Rhys planted the sapling near the fence, sweat on his neck and dirt under his nails. "It'll grow straight with the right care," he said, pressing soil around the roots. "Needs space to stretch." Penelope leaned on the hoe, watching the way he handled the tree, slow, sure, as if it were something delicate. "Not everything gets that kind of chance," she said. He looked up. "It does now." Later, while the boys fished with willow poles near the bend, Penelope and Rhys sat on the porch steps, boots dusted, a pot of beans simmering behind them. A hawk circled overhead, casting a long, silent shadow. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, eyes on the sky. Every day, she traced a knot in the porch wood with one fingertip. "I was meant to marry a banker's son once. Before the fire, my father had a plan. What happened to him? He drowned trying to pull my mother from the house." Her voice caught, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't leave without her sewing chest. He wouldn't leave without her. Rhys didn't offer pity. He didn't shift or soften. He just sat still beside her, the quiet between them steady. "I haven't sewn since," she said. "Maybe don't force it. I'm not, just. Sometimes I miss the sound of thread pulling through cotton." He reached for the brim of his hat, turned it in his hands. "You can make a new sound. Doesn't have to mean forgetting." She glanced at him. "You always this sure of what to say?" "No. Just with you." That night, after the boys had fallen asleep curled side by side under the quilt, Penelope stepped outside with a blanket around her shoulders. Rhys was on the porch again, sharpening his knife by lantern glow. "I found something in the shed," she said, holding out a weathered wooden box. "Had your name carved in the lid." He opened it without speaking. Inside lay a stack of letters, bound with a strip of faded blue cloth. One slipped free. Penelope bent to retrieve it, but paused when she saw the name written across the front. "Your sister," Rhys nodded. "She died before the war ended. I couldn't make it back in time." Penelope handed it to him without asking further. He tucked it beneath the others and closed the lid. "I didn't mean to pry," she said. "You didn't." They sat until the lantern burned low, the silence between them no longer something to fill but something shared. When she stood to go inside, he rose too, just a breath behind her. "If I asked you to stay," he said, "not just for the boys." "Would you?" She turned, blanket slipping from her shoulders. "Why now?" "Because today, watching you in the garden, I stopped seeing what saved me and started seeing what I needed to build something right." Her hands found his work rough, warm. "I told myself I wouldn't trust another man's word." "Then don't," he said. "Trust his actions." She stepped closer, her forehead resting against his chest. His arms circled her, slow and certain. Inside, the fire held steady. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clear above the pines. And between them, something rooted itself deep, quiet, and sure, like the tree they'd planted that morning. The rain came long and low one morning in late April. Not the kind that flooded or howled, but a steady hush that softened the world. Penelope stood at the cabin window, the boys still asleep behind her, watching the mist roll off the hills like breath. Rhys had gone out before dawn to check on the snares he'd set along the tree line. She boiled water, set out flour and lard, and began kneading biscuits by the heat of the stove. By the time he returned, his coat was soaked to the elbows and his boots left tracks across the floorboards. He carried a brace of rabbits over one shoulder and a narrow-eyed fox in a burlap sack. "Found her caught up near the pines," he said, setting the sack down gently. "Didn't break anything, just frightened." Penelope opened the sack, cautious. The fox blinked up at her, wet and trembling but uninjured. She fetched a bowl of scraps and set it beneath the bench. "You always bring home strays?" she asked, brushing water from his sleeve. "Only the ones that look like they're worth the trouble." She gave him a look, dry as linen, and passed him a towel. "You're dripping." He stripped off the coat and hung it near the hearth, then crouched beside the fox, watching her lap water without flinch or fret. "Used to raise chickens," he said, voice low. "My father'd shoot any fox came near, said they were thieves by nature." She knelt beside him. "And you?" "I figure hunger ain't a crime." They ate quietly that morning, biscuits, dried apples, and salt pork. Jacob watched the fox with fascination, Jessie with caution. Penelope let them ask questions but made it clear the animal wasn't a pet. Rhys said nothing, just listened, his eyes on Penelope more than once. When the rain broke mid-afternoon, Penelope took the boys to gather wild onions along the slope behind the cabin. Rhys stayed behind to repair the south corner of the shed where a beam had rotted through. He worked until his hands ached and the hammer split the air with a rhythm that steadied something in his chest. By the time they returned, Jacob's pockets were full and Jessie's knees were muddy. Penelope's cheeks were flushed from the climb. "Found fiddlehead ferns too," she said, brushing her skirt clean. "I'll boil them tonight." Rhys leaned against the shed, wiping sweat from his brow. "You always know what's safe to eat. My mother taught me before I could read. Said if I ever got lost, I'd at least not starve." Rhys paused. "You think you're still lost?" Penelope tilted her head. "I think I've stopped running." That evening, she placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside were needles, threads in a dozen shades, and a pair of shears dulled with age. "I found it under the floorboards," she said. "Belonged to whoever lived here before, I guess." Rhys turned the shears in his hand. "You going to use them?" She nodded. "I think it's time." She spent the next few days mending what little they had, stitching the torn hem of Jessie's shirt, reinforcing the knees of Jacob's trousers, patching the lining of Rhys's coat. She didn't ask for his thanks, and he didn't offer any. But he watched her hands, the way they moved with purpose, and something settled in his chest that hadn't before. One afternoon, while the boys napped in the loft, Rhys stood behind her as she worked a length of calico into a new curtain. "I've never seen you sit still this long," he said. "I'm not sitting," she replied without looking up. "I'm building something." He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. "You think you'll stay?" She laid the needle down, turned to face him. "I already have." He didn't move, just looked at her, the shape of her face in the golden light, the fine thread caught on her sleeve, the way her eyes held his without hesitation. "Penelope," he said, her name quiet like a vow. "I want to build something too." "With you?" She rose slowly, her hand finding his, fingers threading through calloused ones without pause or ceremony. "I know," she said. "You already started." Outside, the fox slipped out from beneath the porch and darted into the brush, wild and whole. Inside, Penelope and Rhys stood close, their hands joined, the quiet around them deep and steady. Neither rushed the moment. They didn't have to. By early May, the last frost had loosened its grip from the valley. Rhys drove fence posts along the pasture's edge, while Penelope taught Jessie and Jacob how to turn the soil without tearing the roots beneath. They planted beans and carrots, first crops that could survive a surprise chill, then started squash further south, where the ground held more sun. Penelope had sewn a new dress from calico she found rolled tight in an old chest under the loft eaves. She wore it now, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a narrow strip of blue ribbon tucked at her collar. Rhys noticed the ribbon but didn't speak of it. Instead, he handed her the last handful of seed potatoes and watched the gentle way she pressed them into the earth. That evening, while the stew cooked, Rhys walked out to check the western field where a group of mule deer had come down from the ridge. When he returned, Penelope was sitting on the porch rail, her bare feet resting on the worn plank below, her hair loose for the first time since they left the ranch. "You've been quiet," she said, not turning. He sat beside her, boots scuffed and trousers dusty. "Thinking, you don't usually do that out loud." He looked out across the land. "I ain't sure I ever thought about what life could be after surviving it. Felt like all I was doing was keeping ahead of the next bad thing. And now, I'm wondering what it means to stay when nothing's chasing you." She looked at him then, her face open in the fading light. "I wonder that too." He reached for her hand, broad and calloused, fingers brushed with soil. "I was thinking we could make it official." She blinked once. "What do you mean?" "I mean I want to marry you, Penelope Prescott, not for the boys or the house or the land. Just because you're the one who makes this place feel like it's mine." She stared at him, breath somewhere between held and released. "I was 16 the last time someone asked me that." He was scared of horses and couldn't hold a hammer right. "Do I need to prove I'm better with both?" "No." Her voice softened. "You already have." He stood then, not for ceremony, but because he wanted to meet her with his full height, with nothing between them but the thick air of spring dusk. She stepped down beside him, still barefoot, and placed her hand against his chest, just above the buttons of his shirt. "Yes," she said. The next morning, Rhys rode to town with Jacob to speak with the circuit preacher who came through once a month. Jessie stayed behind, helping Penelope boil linens and scrub the cabin floor. She hummed as she worked, not a hymn or a tune from town, but something her mother used to sing while hanging sheets out to dry beside the garden fence. They married 2 days later beneath the cottonwoods, with the river giving voice behind them and the boys standing proud in their cleanest shirts. The preacher read from a worn Bible, and Penelope spoke her vows without hesitation, her hand steady in Rhys's. He didn't dress in anything different, just his cleanest shirt, and the coat she'd mended with a square of brown linen, but she'd never seen him look more like a man you could build a life beside. Afterward, they shared bread and dried fruit, and Rhys poured a small jar of apple whiskey he'd kept hidden behind the shed for a day that mattered. Jessie fell asleep on a quilt before the sun had dipped low, and Jacob watched fireflies blink across the tall grass with eyes heavy from joy. Rhys and Penelope sat outside after dusk, her head resting on his shoulder. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" she asked quietly. "No, me neither." He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth. She turned to him without fear, without question. Their lips met not with urgency, but with the firm grace of something earned. When they pulled apart, she smiled, not for show, not for anyone watching, but for him alone. That night, they lay in the loft together for the first time, the boys curled beneath them in their own corners, the cabin quiet but for the wind through the trees. Rhys pressed his hand to her back as she drifted to sleep, the rise and fall of her breath against him the only sound he needed. Years passed. The garden grew fuller each season. Rhys built a second room onto the cabin with Penelope's help. Jacob learned how to shoe a horse, and Jessie took to carving wood animals that they sold at market when the preacher came through. Penelope taught the boys to read using books Rhys traded for in town. She stitched curtains for both rooms and wrote letters to a cousin back in Kansas, who never replied, but gave her peace just the same. When the first frost came again, Penelope stood at the edge of the garden, shawl wrapped tight, watching the sky go silver. Rhys came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You cold?" he asked. "No, just remembering." He kissed the side of her neck. "We're not going anywhere." She turned in his arms, her eyes steady. "Neither am I." Together, they watched the sun rise over the Bitterroots, the world quiet and wide, their life unfolding not in grand gestures but in the daily grace of two people who had chosen, again and again, to stay.